Hey, I told everyone that the last Friday the 13th was the last one. It said the final chapter right there in the title. What are you trying to make me out to be? A big fat pants liar face? Well, looks like Jason's back again in, what are they calling it this time? A new beginning? Yeah, Jason's back. Sort of. Welcome back to ML Miller Frights, a part of the Kings of Horror Network. I'm ML Miller. While you might be watching this video on the Kings of Horror Network, I urge you to click over to my ML Miller Frights YouTube page and give it a like. Please share with all of your buddies. Click subscribe to this channel, and don't forget to ring that bell for notifications. The release of the Shout Factory's Friday the 13th Collection Deluxe Edition box set has prompted me to go back and watch the films all over again. Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning, came out in 1985. It was directed by Danny Steinman and written by Martin Kittrosser and David Cohen, as well as Danny Steinman. In no way will Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning, ever be mistaken as the best film in the Friday the 13th franchise. But through the years, the film itself has come to mean numerous things to me. As a child growing up loving the Friday the 13th series, and watching a new Friday the 13th film being released every year, the film was a refreshing testament that Jason would never die, even after his so-called final chapter. As a preteen, I appreciated A New Beginning for its gratuitous nudity, which I'll get into in a minute, but still needs to be mentioned when talking about this film. And as an adult who loves the genre but is able to recognize its faults, I find it somewhat of a turning point for the film series. At the end of Part 4, we're led to believe that Jason Voorhees was dead and buried. As Tommy Jarvis thwacked him in the head with a machete and he slid down the length of it, upon falling to the floor, it seemed that Jason had heard his last kill, 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 ma, ma, ma. But box office numbers proved to be more powerful than any massive head wound, and less than 1 year later, a new Friday the 13th film, this one redundantly titled A New Beginning, was churned out. Director Danny Steinman was set to direct the sequel to Last House on the Left, but when that production went belly up, he was shuffled over to Crystal Lake. With the way Friday the 13th Part 5 A New Beginning ended up, it appears the Rape Revenge saga may have been a little better fit for him. Steinman's takes and retakes for the nude scenes in this film are much talked about in Crystal Lake Memories, the book documenting the making of the Friday the 13th series, and one that leaves a kind of bad taste in my mouth upon rewatching it. Still, as a teenage boy, I remember drooling like a dog at the amount of nudity in this film, which consists of only 3 scenes, but these scenes are about as gratuitous as one can get in terms of maximum boobage. One of my most vivid recollections about Part 5 was seeing it in the theater sitting next to my mom. I was 12 in 1985 and unable to see the film without her being there. When the scrumptious Deborah Sue Voorhees removes her top and reveals her large assets, I clearly remember an older teen a few rows back exclaiming, "Oh my God," at that glorious sight. It's one of those mixed emotional moments that littered my youth, where the budding man in me wanted to laugh and maybe ogle a bit, but the embarrassed kid in me sitting next to my mom wanted to shrink into my seat and completely disappear. Nude scenes aside, Friday the 13th Part 5 should be commended for continuing the story of the Camp Crystal Lake murders and its most infamous resident practically right where the last one left off. Opening with what turns out to be a dream sequence, Corey Feldman returns briefly as Tommy Jarvis, spying on a pair of grave robbers digging up Jason Voorhees' grave, only to find him alive and stabbing in his coffin. As the dark eyes of the hockey mask focus on Tommy in the pouring rain and advances, a much older Tommy, played woodenly by John Shepard, awakens in a car on his way to a new mental facility. We learn Tommy has been shuffled around from one mental facility to another in the 10 years since the night he took on Jason, but the ghost of that night and the killer himself seems to be appearing in the periphery, haunting his waking hours as well as his dreams. But Jason's dead, right? This becomes fuzzy when the bodies start piling up, and while all the fingers point to Tommy as the killer, the sheer randomness of the kills and the distance between them may say otherwise. And the bodies do pile high, as Steinman reveals that part of the deal he had with the studios was that a kill had to happen every 8 minutes in this film. A few things are worth mentioning here. Corey Feldman was apparently set to star in Part 5, but he decided to pass in favor of a little film called Goonies from some obscure filmmaker that has since faded into obscurity. Because of that, Feldman's role was lessened to a cameo. His scene in the film is fun, but it still makes me wonder how cool it would have been to have Feldman reprise the role, and this film were made with a younger, preteen cast. But this would have taken out the chances for all of that nudity, which seemed all important to Steinman and my teen loins. Still, the appearance of Different Strokes Dudley, played by Shavar Ross, and his weird importance to this story may be attributed to the fact that a kid was written into the script at one point thinking it might have been Feldman, and a rewrite kept the kid role in there for some reason. Ross is present all the way through the climax of this film, but oddly disappears after the showdown in the barn. The cast is pretty broad, covering age ranges, races, and classes. This Jason has no compunction to killing everyone and anyone in his path. There seems to be no rhyme or reason to the victims, though they do have a tertiary affiliation to the group home Tommy is staying in. Despite the large cast, Steinman seems to be able to bring out some characteristics of the kids that make them memorable. Some of Tommy's fellow wards of the state are simply categorized by their symptomology. Others are simply there for boob time. But unlike later installments, each of the kids felt unique and decently developed. Standouts include the fun subplot of Jake, played by Jerry Pavlon, awkwardly hitting on Robin, played by Juliette Cummins, the gross backwoods trashiness of Ethel, played by Carol Locatel, and Junior, played by Ron Sloan, goth queen Violet, played by Tiffany Helm, and her awesome dance moves, Demon, played by Miguel A. Nunez Jr. and his irritable, enchilada-laden bowels, and of course the bouncy goodness of Deborah Sue Voorhees. While the personalities were on point, the killings for the most part were uneventful and unspectacular. The MPAA was starting to come down on the series, so there wasn't a lot of blood. Kills were quick and cut away from. Some even occurred off-screen. The main problem was that there was so many kills that the shock lessened the more they occurred. Less is definitely more in this case, and there's no use in piling the bodies high if there's no rhyme or reason to the killings and less personality to the people who were dying. For the most part, stabbings seem to be the soup of the day this Friday the 13th. There are a few standouts, like a road flare to the mouth and a belt wrapped around someone's head and tightened. That said, most of the killings happen simply to up the body count and with little other purpose. Still, standouts like Vi's breakdance leading up to her death and the aforementioned Deborah Sue Voorhees' bouncy death scene make some of them worth watching. Steinman attempts to take the series back to its roots and hype up the mystery element of the series that was missing since Part 2. I don't think it's a spoiler to reveal that the killer is not Jason, but anyone with 3 brain cells can put together who the culprit is with his obvious dialogue and pretentious staring at the camera every time he's in frame. Still, I think the attempt to make the identity of the killer more mysterious was a good idea that simply had a poor execution. I find it interesting that the seeds of one of the most annoying aspects of a later Friday the 13th film, Jason Goes to Hell, were planted firmly in Friday the 13th Part 5. That being the fact that Crystal Lake's death curse is more of an infection rather than one singular killer. The fact that numerous people are perceived as possessed by the soul of the killer are hinted at numerous times in this film with 2 different people. Tommy himself fights the urges to kill. And while there is a hokey motive motivating the real killer in Part 5, it could be argued that Jason was haunting the killer from beyond the grave. Yes, it's a leap, but given the possession body swapping that goes on in Jason Goes to Hell, it's interesting to see that there was evidence supporting that 4 films before it. One could even argue that the death curse leapt from Pamela Voorhees and into Jason between Parts 1 and 2, as well as it leaping into Tommy Jarvis as a kid in Part 4. All of the franchises have their missteps. Texas Chainsaw has The Next Generation, Halloween has Season of the Witch. There comes a time in every franchise when the studios see that the same old was starting to lose its luster and new elements are injected in order to revitalize the franchise. But changing Friday the 13th back to a whodunit, even though it's the type of film that began the franchise in the original, was a mistake. Without Jason, there is no Friday the 13th, and the studios quickly brought him back, zombified and stronger than ever in Part 6. Tom Morga goes uncredited as Jason in Part 5. While he isn't the best Jason, I think he does a decent, albeit stiff job of playing the killer. He really doesn't get much screen time until the climax, as the film returns to the trend shown in earlier installments, where we only see the killer from the waist down. This is a technique of showing the kills that tied the series to its giallo roots, and one that is dropped in the next installment and rarely returned to in later installments. Again, seeing only the killer's shoes and hands brandishing a weapon is much more suspenseful than a full shot of Jason any old day, but later installments seemed to think otherwise. Morga does a decent job during the final battle, giving a very physical performance reminiscent of Steve Dash and Ted White before him. Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning, ended up being a prime example of why folks turn their noses up at this franchise. It's filled with senseless kills, gratuitous nudity, and a threadbare plot serving only to up the body count. While the first four were bound together not only in timelines but also in theme and tone, A New Beginning boiled the film down to its basics, and instead of exploring themes of innocence lost, mother and son relationships, authority challenged, and disregarded youth, it was death and sex and more death and big boobs. While I don't hate the film, it annoys me that this is the one that seems to give those who dislike the series ammunition against the series as a whole. Repeated viewings has made me soften up to Part 5. I like what it attempted to do, but there seemed to be a very mean and somewhat raunchy underlying tone that felt off, even for a series about a campground serial killer. Extras on this disc include a commentary track by Steinman and some of the cast, as well as behind-the-scenes interview shorts featuring Corey Feldman talking about his brief cameo and what he would love to do if he ever returned to the franchise as Tommy Jarvis. There's also another episode of the Tales of the Camp Blood series that makes the actual film seem downright dense in terms of character and story, and Part 2 of the Crystal Lake Massacre, a faux tabloid news show tying the story of Part 4 and 5 together that's actually pretty fun and smartly written. It also has a making-of feature talking with the key cast members, including both men behind the hockey mask in this episode, Dick Weiland, who played Roy, and Tom Morga, who is the stuntman who played most of the scenes of Jason in the climax. Director Steinman also has some interviews, and composer Henry Manfredini gets a chance to talk about what he did with the music. It's fun supplemental stuff, but nothing utterly jaw-dropping is revealed in any of it. Still, it's a must for any self-respecting Friday the 13th fan. That'll be it for today. Please chime in the comments down below and let me know what you think of this video. How on the nose or mind-numbingly wrong I am, or you can counter with your own review. If you like this video, please pound that thumbs up button. Share this video with your social media addicted pals. If you're looking for written reviews, you can find them on mlmillerwrites.com. Don't forget I have 2 new horror comic book trade paperbacks you should look for. Both Grave Trancers and Pirouette, collecting never-before-published issues, can be found in only the finest of comic book stores right now. And be sure to subscribe to this channel, and ring that bell for alerts to be the first to see my future videos. Thanks so much for your time, and take care.
You're doomed to live the life you're meant to be, stuck inside your